Hello ladies and gents, boys and girls, people of all ages, sexualities and identities, and welcome back to another comic book review. And today's comic book review is none other than The Crow. Yes, the exact comic book that the 1994 film is based on. So let's start off with the major differences between the film and the comic book. The comic book actually starts off with Eric already being dead. We don't have this whole kind of flash scene of a bunch of cops. No, that's not how the comic book starts off. The comic book starts off with Eric already on the hunt for the people who wronged him. Now, in the film, we're introduced to Eric falling out of the window and essentially finding him in this position in which he's already being taken off on a stretcher. Now, the falling out the window bit happens later in the film, but the fact that he's already on a stretcher is very evident in the film. However, in this comic book, it gives a different explanation to Eric's death. It turns out that in the Eric Draven comic book, he actually died whilst out trying to fix his car. Him and Shelley had been celebrating Christmas and everything that was leading up to Halloween, when all of a sudden they decide to take a trip down to the beach and their car breaks down. Upon discovering the fault with their car, Eric tries to fix it, but a bunch of people turn up and begin to pester him and his girlfriend. They begin to remark about the way that she looks so beautiful and innocent, and then about what they want to do with her. This annoys Eric, and so he tries to push them away, fearing for Shelley's life. However, this doesn't work out very well for Eric because he gets shot in the back of the head and then pushed to the side. They then decide to shoot him again to prove to his girlfriend that he has in fact died. However, what they don't realise is Eric isn't fully dead yet. Eric begins to hear the muffled screams of his girlfriend, and a crow from the afterlife tells him to look away. But Eric finds himself in a position in which he's not quite sure if he can do that, especially under his own conscience. Then flashing back forward to the beginning of the comic book and finding ourselves in this position where he's hunting down all of the people who wronged him, Eric then goes round on a mission around the city. This is when he bumps into a little girl, Sherry. Sherry describes him as a clown, which isn't too different to how Sarah describes him in the movie. Eric finds himself letting little Sherry know that essentially he's going to make sure her mother comes home. Then he says the iconic line from the movie, which is, Mother is the word for God in the mouths of and hearts of children everywhere. He says this to her mother and she runs home. Then he continues taking a lot of people down. Across the course of this, we keep seeing more flashbacks throughout the comic book on what Eric and Shelley's life was like before. Especially most of the intimate times in which they spend together in bed and Eric messes around in the bathtub. But at some point we then flash back forward and Eric is now in the shop of the man at the pawn shop who was given Shelley's ring. The guy claims that he doesn't know what he's talking about, and the crow decides to set his whole shop on fire. Very similar to what happens in the film. Except from the only difference in the film is he uses a shotgun. Another key important moment I think from the Crow comic book that I should address is there is a split moment which I'm guessing is Eric dreaming in the beginning of this, and maybe his kind of connection to the afterlife, is we find Eric on a steam train. Now Eric watches a horse fly into barbed wire. This is very similar to the modern adaptation of The Crow because we find Eric Draven in that version trying to pull barbed wire out of a horse. Now I'm guessing in both depictions of The Crow, the kind of metaphor of the horse is most probably supposed to be Shelley, and the barbed wire is what Eric describes as something beautiful being destroyed and used and abused. Going back forward again though, we find Eric waking up from this after a skeletal man asks him for a ticket, and we find Eric hunting down more and more people. Now, the one thing I find really nice in the comic book version that doesn't necessarily happen in the live action version is the fact that we have Eric being followed by a bunch of cats. Now, these cats essentially lure anyone who is in harm's way to safety. The other thing that I thought was really interesting is the guy who injects himself, that you might remember from the film. In the comic book version, he does still get injected, but this time as a mercy from Eric. Eric decides to inject the guy with an overdose of morphine to basically free him of his sins. The guy admits in life that he believes that he knows his own sins, and rather than apologize for them, he would rather take death. He knows he can't take anything back, and most importantly, he knows if he lives, he'll just continue doing the bad things he's done. So the crow grants him death and then goes on for one final kill. He goes for the big boss who tries to escape, but before trying to escape, he decides to round up every single last man he has. Eric then beforehand cuts a circle into his chest, which is a signifying the fact that Jesus gets thorns on his head. Eric signifies this not only as a justification for Jesus, but more as a justification for his own death. After all, he was shot in the back of the head with a bullet. And the back of the head usually signifies a crown, because people call your head your crown. After killing off all the remaining people, Eric then returns back to the graveyard to meet with Shelley one more time, and now finally be at peace and return to the afterlife. So, the Crow comic book. What did I think of the comic book compared to the films? I definitely feel like the comic book is brilliant. I also feel like it even more justifies why Brandon Lee's version is the best version of the Crow. Not only because he embodies Eric Draven the best, but he also really understands the philosophy and the understanding of all this poetry that Eric really believes in throughout the comic book. He's not just saying things for a laugh, he actually has a purpose behind it. He's trying to teach these people a lesson. And that lesson is that they will not get away with treating people and hurting people forever. I also like that in this comic book we find ourselves in this position in which we really get to see the dark side of these kind of corrupt crooks who think they're better than everyone. I mean, they literally shoot a harmless old lady in the comic book, whereas in the film we just pretty much see them blowing up buildings and sticking cigarettes out on their tongues. We also, at the end of this comic book, get a justification that these people may pay for prostitutes, but they chuck them around, they beat them, they mistreat them. They see everyone in their world as an object of their own desires and own ambitions, and they think they can do whatever they like with that. And because that is so out clear in this comic book, I also like the fact that in the beginning of this comic book, we get a justification from someone who knew the writer about why Joe O'Barra wrote this story of pain, this story of loss, this story of resurrection and justice and trying to make amends for what's happened. And for all those reasons I've mentioned, that's why I give the Crow comic book a solid 10 out of 10. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next comic book review. Until then, goodbye, stay beautiful, you beautiful people.